In this module, we'll consider how policymakers use various criteria to evaluate their policy alternatives they develop, and consider the methods that policy analysts use to research the likely impacts of these alternatives. But how do policymakers and policy analysts actually go about choosing the appropriate policy alternative? Well, they assess the proposed policy options, evaluate the merits of existing programs, and look to see what's working and where things have gone astray. Let's consider several real-life evaluations of alternatives. How does the average person rationally make decisions about these? The key word here is rationally. Remember, cost versus benefit. This idea in itself is an evaluation or an evaluative criterion by which a person can make a decision. Consider, for example, your own situation in the college that you chose to attend. Why did you select it? Was it some collection of benefits, like the prestige of the college, the usefulness of the degree, the number and variety of courses they offered, or potentially the financial aid you received? Did it also have to do with the costs? Perhaps the tuition, the cost per credit hour? Could you commute? Do you have to stay on campus? The answers to all of these questions could be added up for each college that you consider, but ultimately, one college won out over the others. In policy analysis, the process is more formalized. We employ evaluative criteria to make comparisons between the various alternatives. It's important that when making comparisons, to ensure that we have the same criteria used from one unit to the next. Why is this the case? Well, think about it. You want to compare apples to apples, not apples to watermelons. Thus, having the same units or the same evaluative criteria allows us to compare them and ultimately have valid comparisons. Yet from your readings, you'll note that there are several different criteria we can use. However, not all of them are used at once. Why not? Well, as always, policymakers and policy analysts suffer from a scarcity of time and resources. Further, not all of the evaluative criteria may apply. And additionally, some of these criteria you may put more weight on or greater importance on. So why do we use evaluative criteria? Well, making policy decisions is very complicated. The criteria help us to focus on what's important. They provide us a framework or structure to help organize our thinking and allow us to actually consider one policy versus another. Yet, what is problematic about this? Think about the first sub-bullet point. The criteria focuses on what you think is important. Clearly, there's a degree of subjectivity there, and thus it can vary from one person to the next. Yet, the hope is, if we do policy analysis and it's done by motivated policy experts, ultimately, these professionals will try to limit their personal bias and hopefully develop better policy decisions. Remember, very often policy analysts will go to policy networks and look to see parallels. They look for consensus. Doing so can mitigate individual bias. In using these evaluative criteria, you want to work backwards. The type of decision being made should match the criteria used. Further, you need to be able to operationalize it. Again, how do you know if the problem is actually being addressed by the policy? So then, which evaluative criteria from the big long list the policymakers and policy analysts typically use? Most often, the big 3 E's are employed. That is, effectiveness, efficiency, and equity. Though effectiveness and efficiency tend to be the two most heavily leaned upon. All right, let's start working our way through the big long list of evaluative criteria policymakers and policy analysts can choose from. Let's start off first with the most important, effectiveness. Did or does the policy actually work? Does the policy meet the outcome goals that you established? This is pretty straightforward and easy to view because we use the operational measures when we defined our problem. An effective policy is thus one that meets the goals. However, remember that this is only an estimate of its likelihood of working. Policy analysis occurs before the policy is actually made and put in place in the policy-making process. Thus, policy analysts need to project forward and try to consider if the policy alternatives will actually meet their goals, without actually seeing if they actually will.